Hello, I'm Murdo MacDonald, and my purpose today is to look at the cosmopolitanism of Patrick Geddes and his circle as it relates to India and Japan in particular. Here we see a picture of Geddes himself. Now, the importance of Japanese art to European art in the 19th century is accepted as something of a commonplace, but such influence has been less considered in the context of Patrick Geddes and the Celtic Revival. But as we can see here, Patrick Geddes' evergreen has a number of clear Japanese influences. Most obvious is E.A. Hornell's Madame Chrysantheme from the Book of Autumn, which appeared in 1895, the year after he had himself returned from a journey to Japan. It's likely that Hornell was invited to contribute to the evergreen by his friend Charles Mackay, who had a central role in the magazine. In that same issue, one finds Mackay's own image, Lyot Leaves, as we can see here, and we can also see that it relates strongly to Japanese art. This becomes most obvious when you see it compared with a Hiroshige landscape. Hiroshige was a particularly important influence throughout Europe at the time. Another evergreen artist who absorbed these Japanese compositional and stylistic lessons was Robert Burns. In his Natura Naturans, published in 1895, again one finds the influence of Hiroshige. So we can see that the Celtic Revival artists of Geddes' milieu were very much influenced by Japan. But the influence went both ways, for Geddes' planning ideas were themselves influential in Japan. That aspect was explored by Toshihiko Ando of Saitama University in a remarkable paper given at a conference in Yamaguchi in Japan in 2004. The conference marked the 150th anniversary of Geddes' birth. But Ando notes that the first major Japanese figure to read Geddes in depth was not in fact a planner, but the pioneering modernist writer Natsumi Soseki. Soseki read Geddes' The Evolution of Sex, co-authored with Arthur Thompson, when he visited London and Scotland from 1900 to 1902. On his return to Japan, Soseki transformed Japanese literature for the modern period, and it is intriguing to find Geddes linked to such an important Japanese writer. Soseki's interest in Geddes was considered in more detail at the 2004 conference by Kiyoshi Okutsu of Yamaguchi University. In the same paper, Professor Okutsu drew analogy between the cultural revivalism of Geddes and the cognate activities in a Japanese context of Kakuzo Okakura, the cultural activist who revitalized traditional approaches to painting in Japan. He is best known in the West for his English-language introduction to Zen, the Book of Tea, first published in New York in 1906. An illustrated edition of the Book of Tea was published in Edinburgh in 1919 by T. N. Fowles, a publisher who also published Geddes' work. Now, Okakura and Geddes never met, but they had a very significant mutual friend in the Irish-born cultural activist Margaret Noble. Margaret Noble is a crucial cultural figure of the time who, under the name of Sister Nivedita, became the linchpin of the revival of Hindu and Buddhist culture in India in the years before her untimely death in 1911. Geddes and Nivedita first met in America in early 1900 in the company of Swami Vivekananda, whose disciple Nivedita had become, and later that year they met again at the International Exhibition in Paris. At that Paris exhibition, Vivekananda lectured, rejecting the Hellenistic influence on Indian art. in favour of Hindu and Buddhist influences, a theme taken up by Nivedita and another of Geddes's friends, Ananda Coomaraswamy, in due course. Vivekananda's position was a riposte to the British imperial attempt to define Indian art as an insignificant outgrowth of aesthetic developments driven by Europe. That British view was, of course, a coded justification for imperial domination. After Vivekananda's death in 1902, Nivedita played a crucial role in supporting the revival of the visual arts in Bengal. A key early work was Bharat Mata, or India the Mother. It was the work of Abanindranath Tagore. In political significance, the image relates to the unrest that accompanied the partition of Bengal in 1905. The image, as you can see, rejected Western models and drew on traditional Hindu imagery, taking the form of a woman holding objects in the manner of a four-armed Hindu deity. Stylistically, Bharat Mata owes a debt not only to Indian tradition, but to the revivalist art of Japan, advocated by Okakura, who had travelled to Calcutta in 1902 to meet Vivekananda. But Vivekananda was dying at that point, and after Vivekananda's death, Nivedita made the links that Okakura needed, in particular with the Tagore family. In 1903, Okakura's followers, Yokoyama Taikan and Hishida Shunso, travelled to Calcutta to work closely with Abanindranath Tagore. That same year, Nivedita contributed a substantial introduction to Okakura's Ideals of the East, a book that is in essence a pan-Asian manifesto. The period of Patrick Geddes's friendship with Nivedita, that is to say 1900 to 1911, was also the period during which Ananda Coomaraswamy emerges as a notable thinker. Coomaraswamy held both Geddes and Nivedita in very high regard. Writing of education in Ceylon in 1911, he says, "Above all, I should like students to come under the personal influence of men like Professor Geddes and women like Sister Nivedita." Coomaraswamy performed a crucial role after Nivedita's death in 1911, stepping in to finish her book, Myths of the Hindus and Buddhists. Now, that book has a double significance, for it made available to the West in highly readable prose key aspects of Indian thinking, and at the same time, through its careful illustration under the direction of Abanindranath Tagore, it acted as a showcase for the Bengal school of painting. And we can see examples of those wonderful illustrations here. In January 1912, Coomaraswamy wrote to Geddes, hoping that if he were visiting London, he would be able to attend lectures held by the India Society. Now, that invitation seems innocuous enough, but in fact the founding of the India Society in London 2 years earlier had been a defining moment of resistance to the British imperial perspective on Indian art. In March of that same year, 1912, Geddes sent Coomaraswamy a copy of his text for a community drama exploring the history of the world through the history of education, namely The Mask of Learning, which we see here. Coomaraswamy replied enthusiastically, requesting extra copies of the book, and it is clear from his letter that Geddes's adoption of the Indian term guru in a more extensive text published later in 1912, which we also see here, was due to Coomaraswamy's advice. Geddes also makes clear in that later text that he has absorbed the arguments of Nivedita and Coomaraswamy into his own thought, In 1913, Coomaraswamy published his definitive statement on the independent validity of Indian art in the Burlington magazine, and we can see it here, Indian Images with Many Arms. Now, I'm beginning to approach my conclusion here, and the following year, Geddes travelled to India for the first time. Once he was established in India, Geddes began to share his thinking with Abanindranath Tagore's uncle, the poet, educator and ecological activist Rabindranath Tagore. And in the years that followed, there was a remarkable exchange of insight between the two thinkers. Thanks to the work of Bashby Fraser, this can now be followed. If you are wanting to take the material I have discussed here further, I've explored much of it in my book Patrick Geddes's Intellectual Origins, published by Edinburgh University Press in 2020. There I take Geddes's Scottish cultural and intellectual background as the key to understanding his lifelong interdisciplinary internationalism.